Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. England declares war on France, officially launching them into the 7 Years' War, a global conflict played out in North America as the French and Indian War. However, fighting and skirmishes between England and France had been going on in North America for several years. In the early 1750s, French expansion into the Ohio River Valley repeatedly brought France into armed conflict with the British colonies. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel. In 1756, the first official year of fighting in the 7 Years' War, the British suffered a series of defeats against the French and their broad network of Native American alliances. However, in 1757, British Prime Minister William Pitt, the Older, recognized the potential of imperial expansion that would come out of victory against the French and borrowed heavily to fund an expanded war effort. Pitt financed Prussia's struggle against France and her allies in Europe and reimbursed the colonies for the raising of armies in North America. By 1760, the French had been expelled from Canada, and by 1763 all of France's allies in Europe had either made a separate peace with Prussia or had been defeated. In addition, Spanish attempts to aid France in the Americas had failed, and France also suffered defeats against British forces in India. The 7 Years' War, which involved all the then great powers of Europe, including Prussia, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, Russia, ended with the signing of the treaties of Hubert-Dousburg and Paris in February 1763. In the Treaty of Paris, France lost all claims to Canada and gave Louisiana to Spain, while Britain received Spanish Florida, Upper Canada, and various French holdings overseas. The treaty ensured the colonial and maritime supremacy of Britain and strengthened the 13 American colonies by removing their European rivals to the north and the south. 15 years later, French bitterness over the loss of most of their colonial empire contributed to their intervention in the American Revolution on the side of the Patriots. On May 18, 1756, Great Britain formally declared war on France, thrusting the two longtime rivals into open conflict and officially marking Britain's entry into what would become the 7 Years' War, a global struggle unlike any the world had seen before. Those skirmishes and colonial clashes had been flaring for years, especially in North America, where British and French forces had been engaged in bitter territorial disputes since 1754. It wasn't until this formal declaration that the full weight of European military might was brought to bear. Tensions had been rising steadily as both nations vied for supremacy in trade and territory. France had built strong alliances with Austria and other continental powers, while Britain allied itself with Prussia, whose king, Frederick the Great, was already embroiled in his own battles on the European continent. This web of alliances ensured that what began as a colonial dispute quickly escalated into a multi-theater war that stretched across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and even India. Britain's decision to declare war came after a series of provocations at sea and in the colonies, where French forces had seized British ships and forts. Parliament, increasingly concerned with France's growing influence and alarmed by reports from the American frontier, moved to take decisive action. The declaration was not merely a response to colonial aggression, it was a calculated move in a broader contest for imperial dominance. The war that followed would be one of the most consequential of the 18th century. For Britain, the 7 Years' War ultimately resulted in a sweeping victory, but it came at great cost. The massive debts incurred during the conflict would later lead to increased taxation in the American colonies, sowing the seeds of rebellion and revolution. For France, defeat meant the loss of nearly all its possessions in North America and a significant weakening of its global standing. In many ways, Britain's declaration of war on France in 1756 marked a turning point in history, one that reshaped empires, redrew borders, and set the stage for both the rise of British global dominance and the eventual birth of the United States. The declaration of war by Great Britain against France on May 18, 1756, was not just a formal gesture, it was the ignition of a global firestorm. For years, British settlers and soldiers in North America had been clashing with French forces and their indigenous allies, as both empires struggled to control the rich, uncharted territories of the Ohio River Valley and beyond. These early confrontations, particularly a skirmish led by a young British officer named George Washington in 1754, had already sparked open hostilities. But Europe had remained in a state of uneasy peace until Britain's official declaration forced the world to take sides. Once war was declared, the conflict exploded far beyond the American forests. In Europe, it became a brutal and complex war of alliances. France allied with Austria, Russia, and Sweden, traditional enemies of Prussia, Britain's key ally. The European battles were devastating, with entire regions laid to waste and millions of lives affected. Armies marched across the continent, laying siege to cities and engaging in massive, bloody engagements that tested the strength and strategies of every major power involved. Meanwhile, on the high seas and in far-off colonies, the war became a test of naval power and imperial reach. The British Royal Navy, now stretched across the globe, began blockading French ports and attacking French ships. In India, the British East India Company and its French counterpart turned the subcontinent into another theatre of war. British commander Robert Clive led bold campaigns that would eventually tip the balance of power in India toward the British Crown. Back in North America, the conflict became known as the French and Indian War, and it grew increasingly brutal. Native American tribes were pulled into the fighting, often siding with the French, who had established long-standing alliances with many of them. British forces, meanwhile, pushed forward with new determination. Major battles such as the Battle of Fort William Henry and the Siege of Louisburg showed the ferocity of the fighting and the stakes involved. The tide of war began to turn in Britain's favour after William Pitt the Elder rose to power in 1757. A gifted orator and strategist, Pitt poured resources into the war effort, transforming Britain into a global military force. Under his leadership, the British captured Quebec in 1759 after the dramatic Battle of the Plains of Abraham, a victory that marked the beginning of the end for French power in North America. By the time the war ended in 1763, the world map had changed dramatically. The Treaty of Paris stripped France of most of its overseas empire, ceding Canada to Britain, giving Louisiana to Spain, and ending French ambitions in India. Britain emerged as the world's preeminent colonial power, but it was a victory shadowed by debt and unrest. The cost of the war had drained British coffers, and Parliament soon turned to the American colonies to help repay it, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to revolution. The 7 Years' War, sparked in part by that fateful declaration of war in 1756, was more than a contest for land. It was a global struggle for supremacy that would define the modern age and echo through history for decades to come.